The courtroom smelled like paper and cold marble, the kind of smell that warned you nobody here cared how long you lived, only how fast you broke. Everything inside was polished to a shine, floors that reflected the overhead lights, benches that creaked like they knew secrets, and eyes, too many eyes, some curious, some cruel, all fixed on the same man, Arthur Dawson. He sat at the witness stand in a stiff suit that didn't quite fit, his hands resting on his lap, like he was holding something fragile. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the words clung to the back of his throat like they'd been shackled there for decades. He began, and just then, a cough disguised a chuckle from behind the prosecution's table. The sound wasn't loud, but it sliced the silence in two like a razor. Officer William Hayes didn't look away, didn't hide it, didn't even pretend to be professional. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, smirking with the confidence of a man who had spent too many years watching the system applaud his cruelty. The judge didn't flinch. No one flinched. Arthur's stutter stretched across the room like tension wire, and every pause was an invitation for humiliation. He could feel the heat rising in his neck, feel the eyes stabbing into him, not with empathy, but with expectation, waiting for him to fail, to stumble so badly they could all pretend he never belonged there in the first place. Sir, he tried again, but Hayes leaned forward this time, his voice a whisper that still carried far too well. Maybe someone should spell it out for you, Grandpa. The words weren't just an insult. They were a trap, laid bare with that easy, familiar brand of casual racism that never needed to shout to cut deep. Arthur blinked. Once. Twice. But he didn't look down. His voice had failed him his whole life. His country had failed him. But his eyes had never bowed to anyone, not even now. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, and no one had come to his defense. Not the judge, not the audience, not the people who were supposed to stand for justice. Arthur knew how this worked. He'd been here before, maybe not this building, not this seat, but this moment, this theatre of shame. Oh yes, this was a system that didn't just let men like Hayes mock men like him, it was built for it. And as Arthur struggled to force out his testimony, a storm began to stir, not in the sky, not outside, but deep in the bones of that cold, silent room, because something was about to shift, something no one in that courtroom was prepared for. Arthur Dawson sat motionless in the witness chair, but inside his chest, everything shook, his breath, his confidence, even his sense of time. The courtroom hadn't just gone silent after Officer Hayes mocked his stutter, it had gone complicit. The kind of silence that let injustice stretch its legs and make itself at home. Hayes didn't stop there. He leaned back again, one arm resting lazily over the chair beside him, his badge glinting under the lights like a prize earned not for protecting the public, but for surviving long enough in a uniform to forget what dignity meant. His voice carried in just the right pitch, not loud enough to get scolded, not quiet enough to be missed. It's hard to tell if he's testifying or just learning the alphabet, he muttered to the junior prosecutor next to him, who gave the smallest, shameful laugh, and looked away. That was how men like Hayes operated. Not with rage or open violence, but with calculated humiliation. The kind that could crawl under your skin and rot your self-worth from the inside. Arthur's hand trembled again as he reached for the glass of water beside him, and the sound of it clinking against the glass echoed louder than any objection the judge never gave. A woman in the back row shook her head slowly, as if disappointed that a grown man couldn't speak like a human being. A few seats over, a young court officer tapped on his phone, barely pretending to watch. Every second that passed reminded Arthur of what this place really was. Not a chamber of truth, but a stage, and he was cast in the role of the defeated. The prosecutor rose next, strolling casually toward the stand, clearly confident, rehearsed, and just as smug as the man he was defending. "Mr. Dawson," he said, pausing just long enough to make Arthur's throat tighten. "Would you please try to explain, in your own words, what exactly you think you saw the officer do on the night in question?" There it was, that word, think. Not what you witnessed, not what you experienced, but what you think you saw. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, wrapped in legal civility. Arthur's lips moved, trying to form the sentence, but the words got tangled again, as they always had when the pressure was highest. I saw... Hayes smirked again. "This'll take all day," he said, this time louder, and a chuckle rose from somewhere in the gallery. That's when it hit Arthur. Not like a revelation, but like a memory crashing back without warning. The first time someone had laughed at his stutter, he was 7 years old, standing in front of a segregated classroom with chalk in his hand and his throat frozen in fear. The second time was in a grocery store. The third, at a job interview. And now, the cycle had completed itself. Here, in a courtroom, surrounded by law and white walls, and men who wore uniforms like armor and treated justice like a joke. Arthur clenched the edge of the witness box with his hands, not out of anger, but because he needed something to hold on to in a world where he'd never been allowed to just speak. They didn't want his voice. They wanted to watch him drown in his own silence. But what none of them knew, not the smirking officer, not the complicit judge, not the prosecutor sharpening his words like knives, was that someone was about to walk into that courtroom. Someone who would tilt the weight of the whole damn room. And when that door opened, everything would change. The prosecutor was circling now, slow and smug, like a vulture that knew its prey was too weak to fight back. Arthur sat there, still struggling to breathe through the weight in his chest, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand so tight his knuckles had turned white. Sweat clung to his forehead, not because he was nervous, but because the room was full of eyes that didn't see him as a man, just a weak voice, a stutter, a stereotype. Hayes leaned forward in his chair again, elbow on his knee, chin resting on his fist, his smile taunting, amused. "Mr. Dawson," the prosecutor said, drawing out each syllable like a blade. "Can you be absolutely certain it was Officer Hayes you saw? Or are you simply confused?" He was laying the trap perfectly, subtle enough for the record, cruel enough for the gallery. Another chuckle behind Arthur. This time it was louder. A woman near the back whispered, "Maybe someone should say it for him." And suddenly it was everywhere. The soft laughter, the side glances, the discomfort worn like perfume. This was no longer a courtroom. It was a theatre of humiliation, and Arthur was its caged performance. Even the judge, unmoved and blank-faced, tapped his pen against the bench as if waiting for the moment this would all be over. Hayes crossed his legs and muttered to no one in particular. "Can't even say his name right. But we're supposed to believe he's got a memory sharp enough to accuse an officer." That was it. Not just mockery, but the implication that Arthur's entire existence lacked credibility. Because of his voice, because of his age, because of his skin. And then, just as the prosecutor raised his hand to gesture again, just as Arthur opened his mouth one more time to try and find the words, the back doors of the courtroom swung open with a sharp, echoing creak. Every head turned. Even the judge looked up. And there he was, Arthur's lawyer, not late, not hurried, just walking in like he had already heard everything from behind the wall. Daniel Cole, tall, dark-skinned, sharp suit, sharper eyes. A presence that didn't need to shout to be known. He walked in with the gravity of someone who didn't come to plead for justice. He came to demand it. No words, no rush. He walked straight to the defense table, set down his case file, adjusted his cuff, and finally, looked straight at Officer Hayes. Hayes's smile faltered, just slightly, enough to be noticed, enough to shift the air. Daniel turned to the judge, and for the first time all morning spoke. "Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect that this witness has been subjected to inappropriate mockery by both the opposing counsel and the witness for the prosecution. We will be filing a motion to strike Officer Hayes's testimony entirely, and further, to review courtroom conduct under Section 108B. The courtroom went still, completely still. Hayes uncrossed his legs. The prosecutor blinked. The judge sat back, but Daniel wasn't done. He turned to Arthur now, not as a lawyer looking at a client, but as a man looking at another man, one who had endured. "Mr. Dawson," he said calmly, "take your time. We will not let your voice be stolen." And just like that, the room changed. Not because Daniel shouted, not because he slammed a fist on the table, but because someone, finally, had walked in and reminded them that this wasn't entertainment. This was a trial, and Arthur wasn't alone anymore. Let's pause for just a moment. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life, or seen injustice happen right in front of you? We'd love to hear your story. If this has your attention, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Now, we continue. The silence after Daniel Cole's arrival didn't last long, but it was long enough for power to shift. Officer Hayes, who had spent the morning grinning with arrogant ease, now sat straighter in his chair, the smug tilt of his mouth slowly draining. The judge adjusted his glasses. The prosecutor cleared his throat with a forced chuckle and muttered, "Of course, counsel, we meant no disrespect to the witness." But the damage had been done, and the air in the courtroom had changed. What once felt like a room built to contain humiliation now felt like a room that had just been caught in the act. Still, Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a single folder, and walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom with the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable, because it meant he wasn't here to argue. He was here to dismantle. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "I'd like to begin by submitting Exhibit C, body cam footage from the night in question, reviewed and time-stamped, clearly showing Officer Hayes' unnecessary escalation against my client." The prosecutor blinked, lips parting to protest, but Daniel raised one finger without turning. "Before objections begin, I remind the court that the footage was requested under discovery 2 weeks ago. The state had every chance to review it. Instead, they chose to build their argument around character assassination." There were no gasps, but there was something more powerful: shifting eyes. Eyes that turned toward Hayes, now not with admiration or authority, but curiosity and suspicion. The footage hadn't been played yet, but it didn't matter. The seed was planted, and Hayes knew it, but he wasn't going down quietly. Leaning back again with that same crooked smile he wore like armor, he spoke up. "What's next?" "Gonna tell the court I was picking on his hair too," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, dragging his gaze across the courtroom like a spotlight. Maybe he just couldn't follow orders because he was too busy trying to remember how to say his own name. The words hit the air like a slap. People didn't laugh this time, but no one objected either. The judge sighed, as if tired, not angry. The prosecutor looked away again. The moment stretched, heavy and thick, with a truth no one wanted to name. This wasn't about the law. It never had been. It was about who had the right to be heard without apology, and who had to earn every syllable. Arthur sat quietly, eyes forward. The pain was still there, but something had settled in him now. A stillness not of defeat, but of defiance. Daniel turned slowly to Hayes and finally responded, not with anger, but with a voice calm as glass. "Your joke is noted, officer, but unfortunately for you, the law doesn't stutter, and neither does the footage." With a nod to the clerk, the screen came alive. Grainy footage lit up the courtroom. The audio cracked for a second before settling. There was Arthur, standing in front of a squad car, hands trembling, voice halting, but compliant. And then, clear as day, there was Hayes, shouting, taunting, pulling Arthur's arms behind his back before he could even finish a sentence. "You people always got something to say," the recording caught, every word unmistakable. "Spit it out or shut it." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge stiffened. The footage continued. No resistance from Arthur, no threat, just fear and confusion, and a badge that felt more like a hammer than a shield. The screen went black. No one spoke. Daniel turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, this isn't about speech. This is about a man whose dignity was stolen because the officer in that seat didn't believe he was worth the time it took to listen." Hayes said nothing. He didn't smile this time. He didn't look at Arthur, because now the courtroom was a mirror, and everyone in it had to decide what they saw in their own reflection. The room was electric with the quiet of a truth finally exposed. For the first time, Arthur Dawson could feel his heart, not racing with fear, but with something else, something almost unfamiliar. It was the feeling of being seen, of being heard, The humiliation he'd suffered for decades, the sneers, the mockery, none of it could be undone. But here, in this room, in this moment, there was a shift. For the first time, the weight of those long years didn't crush him. It lifted him. Arthur Dawson wasn't just a frail, trembling man with a stutter anymore. He was a witness, a force. And this room, this courtroom, was a place where he wasn't going to be buried by others' assumptions and scorn. He was here to be heard. Daniel Cole, still standing, didn't look at the prosecutor, didn't look at the judge. He looked at the jury, one by one, with that same unwavering calm that sent waves through everyone in the room. It was no longer about his eloquence or his legal expertise. It was about something far more powerful. It was about speaking to the humanity of those who had been trained to believe they were superior. It was about challenging the casual cruelty that had been woven into their way of life. He turned to Arthur, who was still sitting at the witness stand, but now with a small sense of steadiness, an ember of hope that had refused to die. Daniel's voice dropped, and for the first time in the trial, it became personal. Mr. Dawson, you have the right to be heard. Your story has worth. No one, not Officer Hayes, not anyone in this room, can ever take that from you. Not again. Arthur looked up at Daniel, his chest rising and falling slowly. In those few words, he found not just the strength to endure the trial, but the strength to stand tall in a room that had been designed to crush him. The trial was far from over, but he knew something had shifted. Daniel had turned the courtroom into a battlefield, and for the first time, Arthur felt like a warrior. The judge, who had sat silently through most of the trial, now cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Let's not make a spectacle of this," he said. His voice was cold, but underneath the formal tone, there was a hint of something else. Something closer to fear. Fear that this trial, this case, was slipping from his control. Fear that something bigger than the law was unfolding in front of him. "Your Honor," Daniel began, stepping forward again. "It's not a spectacle. It's the truth. This court can either honor that truth or continue to bury it under decades of systematic oppression. The choice is yours." There was a shift, a strange stillness that seemed to settle over the room. For a moment, even Officer Hayes looked unsettled. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a nervous edge that made him look almost human, something Arthur hadn't seen before. Hayes adjusted his collar, his face twitching ever so slightly. The prosecutor, who had been quiet during the display, cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "We object to the defense's theatrics. We're here for facts, not theatrics," Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You think it's theatrics when a man is humiliated because of his voice, because of his skin, because of his age. You think it's theatrics to witness a man's dignity torn apart and then buried beneath an officer's mockery. No, sir. What's happening in this courtroom is a reckoning that's long overdue." The prosecutor's face flushed. He wanted to retort, but the words got stuck somewhere between his mouth and his mind. He didn't know how to fight back against truth, and truth was standing in front of him now. Tall, unbroken, with the weight of years of suffering behind it. Arthur's eyes didn't leave the screen, even though it had gone dark. His hands still trembled, but now they trembled from something different, something better. The weight of the past, of every insult, every laugh, every moment of degradation, was still there, but it didn't control him anymore. He was free. In the rawest, most fragile sense of the word, he was free. The judge banged his gavel, not in anger but in resignation. "Enough. We will take a short recess." The murmur of voices rose in the room as people stood, shifting, moving. But Arthur didn't stand. He stayed seated, his hands folded together, eyes fixed forward. The world outside of this room didn't matter anymore. He wasn't going to let it. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was filled with lawyers, officers, and other spectators, all moving past one another without much care for the trial. But one person stopped when they saw Daniel Cole and Arthur Dawson standing together near the door. A young woman, the reporter from the local paper, stood frozen for a moment. "You're Arthur Dawson, right?" she asked, stepping forward tentatively. Arthur turned toward her, but Daniel spoke first. "Yes, He is. And you'll be hearing a lot more about him before this is over. You'll hear the truth." The woman nodded, her eyes wide. There was something about Daniel's voice, something in his words that made her realize this wasn't just a case. This was history being written, right in front of her. Back inside the courtroom, Officer Hayes stood up, straightening his uniform, trying to return to his place with a semblance of authority. But the air was different now. There was no longer an unquestioned belief that he could control everything with his badge, his words, his superior attitude. His confidence was shattered. His superiority, at least in this room, was gone. Daniel Cole returned to the defense table, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he paced slowly, as though collecting his thoughts, preparing himself for the next battle. He knew that this fight was far from over. There would be challenges, there would be setbacks, but the tide had begun to turn. It was no longer about proving Arthur's innocence. It was about proving that the system itself needed to change. It was about exposing the ugly truths that people like Hayes had tried to bury, and showing that no one, no matter who they were, what they looked like, or how they spoke, could be ignored any longer. When the court finally reconvened, the atmosphere was tense. Arthur, who had been silent but steady, now felt a new sense of purpose. His voice would be heard, not just in this trial, but in every corner of the world that was watching. The fight wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or made to feel less than human because of their race or their speech. The trial wasn't over, but the battle for dignity, Arthur's dignity, had already been won. The question now was how far that victory would reach, how much of the truth would be exposed before the end, and who would stand beside him when the final gavel came down. The air in the courtroom had shifted, no longer filled with the casual mockery that once seemed like it would suffocate Arthur Dawson. But the battle wasn't over. Far from it. What had started as a trial for his voice had turned into something much bigger. A moment where the truth would either crack the foundation of this corrupt system or be buried under layers of denial and manipulation. The question was no longer whether or not Officer Hayes would be held accountable. It was how far this fight for dignity, for respect, could reach. How many people had already been crushed by the system that Hayes represented? How many had stood in Arthur's shoes, unable to speak but full of a truth they would never get to voice? The recess didn't last long. When the gavel struck again, the room felt even heavier than before. Every corner of it buzzed with a renewed energy, an energy that couldn't quite be named yet, but it was there. Something was about to change. Daniel Cole sat at the defense table, looking over his notes, but his mind was elsewhere. He had seen it before, the exhaustion in his client's eyes when the system bore down on them with all its weight, with all its history. He'd seen the subtle ways the law protected those in power while crushing those without it. And in this courtroom, as Arthur sat in the witness box, his old scars running deep, Daniel knew that this wasn't just about one man's dignity. This was about exposing the lies that had kept people like Arthur small, invisible, and disposable for centuries. This was about every black man who had been silenced, every woman who had been talked over, every child whose dreams were crushed before they could even form words. Officer Hayes sat across the room, still trying to gather himself, but there was something about him now, something exposed. His usual arrogance, his belief that he had the system wrapped around his finger, had been cracked. He was on edge now, glancing nervously at the jury, at the judge, even at his own defense team. He had thought he would be the one walking away from this unscathed, but now, as he sat there, a small part of him was beginning to question his certainty. Was it possible that this time he wouldn't get away with it? But the truth didn't come easily for people like Hayes. His privilege had been ingrained in him for so long that it had become invisible to him, like a second skin. He didn't see how his actions, his words, were born from a place of power that had never once been challenged. He didn't see how every sneer, every insult, every act of racism was not just part of his character, but part of a system that protected him. He didn't see it because, for men like him, this system had always worked in their favor. And now, here was a black man, an old man with a stutter, a man who was supposed to be small, to be ignored, challenging the very fabric of that system. Hayes didn't know it yet, but he was about to lose. Arthur's hands rested on the edge of the witness stand, his palms pressed flat against the cool wood. He had fought his whole life for this moment, for the right to speak and be heard, not as a stereotype, not as a victim, but as a person. He could still hear the whispers from the gallery, the quiet snickers, the casual racism that had been woven into the very air he breathed. They didn't think he had the strength to fight back. They didn't think he had the voice to make them listen, but he did. And with Daniel standing beside him, supporting him, he felt for the first time in years that he wasn't alone. But the hardest part was yet to come. The hardest part was yet to be spoken. Your Honor, Daniel began, his voice carrying through the courtroom. We would like to call Officer Hayes back to the stand. There was a shift in the room, a murmur of uncertainty. The prosecutor's face darkened. He hadn't expected this. Hayes, on the other hand, seemed to stiffen, his eyes narrowing. His voice, when he spoke, was colder than before. What more do you need from me, Cole? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded toward the court clerk, who moved to call Hayes to the stand. The officer stood slowly, his boots scraping against the floor as he made his way to the witness stand. He had expected to walk in and out of this room unscathed, but now, as he looked out at the jury, his certainty was wavering. I want to remind Officer Hayes that this is a courtroom, Daniel said, his voice controlled. It is a space where truth is supposed to be the only thing that matters. But truth, as we have seen, doesn't always speak for itself. Sometimes it must be drawn out. He paused, looking directly at Hayes. Officer Hayes, can you tell this court why, when Mr. Dawson, when Arthur, was simply trying to speak, you chose to mock him? The room went deathly quiet. Hayes's eyes flicked over to Arthur, and for the first time, he seemed to lose his confidence. The words didn't come as easily now. I didn't mock him, Hayes replied, though his voice faltered slightly. I was just what? Daniel interrupted, his words cutting through the officer's attempt at justification. Just trying to get him to speak more clearly. Just trying to make him uncomfortable. Just reminding him that he's not supposed to be here, in this room, in this position. Hayes opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck. The truth was too close now. The veil had been pulled back. He couldn't deny it. Not with the jury watching him. Not with everyone in the room seeing exactly what he had done. He couldn't pretend anymore that his actions were justified. The judge shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. Officer Hayes, I suggest you answer the question. Hayes looked at the judge, his face reddening. I was trying to get him to what? Daniel pressed, stepping closer to the witness stand now, his eyes never leaving Hayes. To prove he deserved to be heard? To prove he had the right to take up space in this courtroom? Tell me, Officer Hayes, why did you find it so funny when Mr. Dawson struggled to speak? What was so amusing about it? Hayes swallowed, his throat dry. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. The courtroom was watching him now. Not with sympathy, not with pity, but with the understanding that the truth could no longer be denied. Daniel wasn't done. He didn't let the officer off the hook. What you did was not just an act of mockery, Officer Hayes. It was an act of power. It was the abuse of your position, the abuse of your uniform. You knew in that moment that Mr. Dawson's struggle was not about his stutter. It was about everything that has been forced upon him because of his race, because of his skin, because of the idea that someone like him should never be seen, should never be heard. And that, Officer Hayes, is the real reason you mocked him. You didn't just mock his voice, you mocked his right to exist on equal terms. The room was silent, save for the sound of a slow, controlled breath escaping from Hayes. He could feel the weight of Daniel's words pressing down on him, pushing through the cracks in his armor. Do you understand that now, Officer Hayes? Daniel asked, his voice steady, yet with a quiet fury that made Hayes flinch. Do you understand that your actions that day weren't just an insult to Mr. Dawson, but to every single person who has ever been treated this way by men like you? There was no reply from Hayes. He couldn't answer because for the first time, he was beginning to understand the enormity of what he had done. The humiliation he had imposed on Arthur was not just a single moment in time. It was part of a history of degradation, of systematic oppression, and it had just been laid bare in front of everyone. Arthur's voice still trembled, but this time, it wasn't because of fear. It wasn't because he doubted himself. His voice trembled because in this moment, he could feel the power of his truth rising to the surface. This was the moment they would remember. Daniel looked at the jury now. The question is no longer whether or not Mr. Dawson deserves justice. The question is whether this court, this system, will finally see him for what he is. A man, a human being, with a right to be heard. A man whose dignity is not yours to trample on. The courtroom was still, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Officer Hayes, once so sure of his control, now stood exposed. He had no words left. The silence was his answer. The courtroom was no longer a place where justice was served. It had become a battlefield, the front lines drawn not by lawyers and defendants, but by the unspoken truth of an entire system built on oppression, on racism, and on the lives of people. Like Arthur Dawson, the air felt thick now, as though every word spoken in the room carried the weight of history with it. And as the trial wore on, it became clear to everyone present. This was no longer just a fight for one man's dignity. This was a reckoning. Arthur Dawson's heart hammered in his chest, not out of fear, but out of something else. Hope. For the first time in his life, he felt the power of his truth rising inside him. It wasn't the shaky voice that betrayed him anymore. It was the strength that came with finally being seen, being heard. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their faces unreadable. But in the silent exchange between them, he knew they were beginning to see what he had always known. What Daniel had so expertly peeled away in front of their eyes. Officer Hayes wasn't just an arrogant cop. He was a symbol of a system that had long ignored people like Arthur. Daniel Cole's gaze never wavered as he addressed the court. His words were measured, but they cut through the room with surgical precision, the echoes of his last question to Hayes still hanging in the air. "Your Honor," he said, turning toward the judge, "we have witnessed today not only the abuse of power by Officer Hayes, but also the way this system allows that power to fester, to grow, to poison everything it touches. What we see here is not an isolated incident. This is a reflection of the very world in which people like Mr. Dawson are seen as less than, ignored, and stripped of their basic dignity." The judge didn't respond, his gavel still in his hand but unused, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, who had spent the majority of the trial trying to paint Arthur as an unreliable witness, now sat quietly, not knowing how to respond to the avalanche of truth Daniel had just unleashed. And Hayes, sitting on the witness stand, his face a mask of arrogance, was beginning to crack. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something else, a flicker of uncertainty. Hayes had always been able to hide behind his badge, behind the power of his position. But now, in the face of undeniable evidence, in the face of a man who was willing to stand up to him, he was starting to feel the sting of his own actions. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He knew there was nothing he could say that would undo what had been revealed. The footage, the words, the mocking laughter, all of it was there for everyone to see. There was no escaping it now. His defense had crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. "I think it's time we all take a good look at what's been happening here," Daniel continued, his voice quiet but firm, as though he was speaking not just to the court, but to everyone who had ever turned a blind eye to the truth. "The question we need to ask ourselves is not whether Mr. Dawson was a reliable witness, but why it took so long for us to even listen to him. Why, in a society that prides itself on justice, do we allow men like Officer Hayes to mock, to belittle, to abuse their power with no accountability? Why does the system protect men like him, while people like Mr. Dawson are left to fend for themselves?" Daniel's words hung in the air like a challenge. The entire room seemed to breathe in unison, holding its collective breath as though unsure of what would come next. Hayes, sitting there, unable to defend himself, shifted in his chair. He was sweating now, beads of perspiration forming on his forehead. The look in his eyes, once full of contempt, now held a flicker of something closer to fear. The jury, once passive and distant, now leaned forward, the truth settling heavily on their shoulders. Arthur, who had once been terrified of speaking, was now a quiet force in the room. His eyes met theirs, and for the first time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel like a target. He felt like a man. And that man was not going to be ignored anymore. There was a stillness in the courtroom that felt like it had lasted an eternity. It was as though the very air had become dense, thick with the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed. And yet, despite the tension, despite the realization of how deep the rot had gone, there was still the question of what would happen next. What would the jury decide? What would the judge do with the truth that had been laid bare? And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw everyone's attention. The judge's eyes flicked toward the entrance, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room held its breath. Another figure stepped inside. A tall man, with a calm but unshakable presence, walking in like someone who had already won, already knew the battle had been fought. It was an unexpected interruption, but it was one that carried a weight of its own. It was another lawyer, another figure from outside the walls of this courtroom, someone who would change the game once again. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who this new figure was, but he knew he had to be here for a reason. Was it a new ally? Another twist in the plot? It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, was starting to listen. This man, whoever he was, had just stepped into the fray, and he wasn't going to let the system keep ignoring the truth. The figure walked confidently to the front of the room, and Daniel Cole gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. The new lawyer turned toward the judge, a look of quiet determination on his face. "Your Honor," the new lawyer began, his voice smooth, steady, and commanding. "I request permission to speak in this matter." The judge, who had been content to let things unfold at their own pace, seemed startled by the interruption, but he nodded, slowly, gesturing toward the floor. "You may proceed." The new lawyer turned toward the jury, his eyes sweeping over each of them carefully, as though assessing them, understanding that the next few moments would carry the weight of history. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice strong and clear, "you've heard the testimony, you've seen the footage, you've witnessed the mockery, the degradation, and the abuse of power that has plagued this courtroom and this case from the start. Now, I ask you, what will you do with that truth?" There was a moment of silence, heavy, like the calm before a storm. The jury's eyes flicked back and forth, unsure of what to make of the new presence in the room. Some of them seemed to squirm, perhaps wondering if they'd made the right decision in coming to this point, while others seemed resolute, emboldened by the lawyer's words. The new lawyer paused for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting the truth sit heavily in the room. "It's time for you to make a decision, not just for Mr. Dawson, but for every person who has ever been made to feel less than, every person who has been silenced, every person who has been mocked and mistreated by the very system that is supposed to protect them. It's time to decide whether or not the truth matters. It's time to decide whether or not he matters." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. The weight of those words lingered. The jury had been reminded not just of what had been done to Arthur Dawson, but of the broader injustice that hung over everyone in this courtroom. And for the first time, it felt like the weight was shifting. The balance of power, so long held by men like Officer Hayes, so long upheld by a system that kept the oppressed silent, was beginning to tip. The truth had been spoken. It was up to the jury now to decide whether they would let that truth be buried again, or if they would allow it to change everything. In that moment, in the silence that followed, Arthur Dawson knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, the world would never look at him the same way again. The room was suffocating, the air thick with tension. The buzz of the courtroom had grown louder since the arrival of the mysterious new lawyer. People whispered, the hum of voices blending into a cacophony of questions, uncertainty, and anticipation. Arthur Dawson sat, his back straight as he listened, watching the new figure that had entered the fray with such quiet authority. Daniel Cole stood by, just as poised and focused as ever. But now, the game had shifted, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The jury sat silently, their eyes flicking from one lawyer to the next, as though they were caught between the weight of the truth they had already seen and the deep uncertainty of what would happen next. This trial wasn't just about Arthur. It was about every black man and woman who had been dragged through a system that had always been stacked against them. It was about every person who had been overlooked, belittled, and mocked simply because of the color of their skin or the sound of their voice. Arthur's fight had become something bigger than just one man's quest for justice. It was a call to arms, a reminder that the weight of history would no longer be allowed to sit on the shoulders of the oppressed. Arthur's eyes darted over to Officer Hayes, who was sitting on the other side of the room, looking more uncomfortable than ever before. Hayes, who had once been so sure of himself, had been forced into silence. His hands gripped the edge of the witness stand tightly, and his jaw was clenched, as though he was trying to hold back something deep inside. Hayes had always used his power like a weapon, wielding it with ease, convinced that no one could touch him. But the walls had begun to close in, and he knew it. He knew that the truth had come for him, and it was now just a matter of whether or not he could outrun it. The judge's gavel banged down sharply, breaking the tense silence. "The court will reconvene," he said, his voice cold and commanding. But there was an underlying uncertainty to it now. He knew that the momentum had shifted, and no amount of legal jargon or formality could stop it. The truth was louder than any gavel. It was louder than the law. It was unstoppable. The defense lawyer, the mysterious figure who had stepped in so suddenly, had been making a compelling case, and the jury could feel it. He wasn't here to just win a trial. He was here to tear down the very fabric of a broken system. He had spoken about the power dynamics that had allowed people like Hayes to trample over men like Arthur, and his words had resonated deeply with the jury. The things that had been done to Arthur, the way he had been mocked, degraded, humiliated. It wasn't just about one man. It was about a whole society that had allowed this kind of injustice to persist for far too long. Hayes sat straighter now, trying to mask his discomfort with a new, forced confidence. The moment that had once belonged to him, the courtroom, his seat of power, his badge of authority, was slipping away. But he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. He had lived his whole life believing that his position gave him the right to speak over others, to mock them, to silence them. He wasn't about to let this moment go without a fight. "You think this is going to change anything?" Hayes spat as he glanced across the courtroom, his eyes lingering on Arthur. "You think I'm just supposed to sit here and let you make me the villain? You've got it all wrong, Cole. This isn't about truth. It's about you trying to twist the narrative to make it look like I'm the bad guy." His voice rose in volume, growing more aggressive with each word, but there was a crack in his composure. He was angry, desperate. Daniel Cole, unfazed, took a slow step toward Hayes. His eyes met the officer's with quiet defiance. "It's not about making you the villain, Hayes," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "It's about making sure that the people you've trampled on for so long finally get to tell their story. It's about giving people like Arthur the dignity that was stolen from them. This trial isn't just about who's right and who's wrong. It's about whether or not we let a system that has been built on racism and violence continue to thrive, unchecked, or if we finally hold people like you accountable for your actions." Hayes didn't respond immediately, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. The truth was cutting into him now, and he knew it. Every word Daniel spoke was like a knife, slicing through the armor he had worn for so long, an armor built not just on the authority of his badge, but on the unspoken belief that he had the right to treat people like Arthur as less than. He had always gotten away with it. The system had protected him. But now, in this courtroom, things were different. The jury was watching closely, their eyes flicking back and forth between the two men. Hayes could feel their gaze on him, the judgment seeping in from every corner of the room. He had always been able to use the law as a shield, but now it was clear to him that the law could just as easily turn on him. His power, his arrogance, had no place in this moment. Arthur Dawson felt the shift. He could see the cracks in Hayes's composure, the tiny shifts in the officer's posture that betrayed the growing unease within him. It was a feeling Arthur had known for so long, being treated as less than, being humiliated, mocked, and belittled. But now it was Hayes who was feeling it. The officer had always worn his uniform like a crown, but Arthur could see that crown slipping. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange, bittersweet satisfaction in that. Hayes wasn't above the law. Hayes wasn't invincible. And Arthur was here, in this moment, to make sure everyone knew it. "Enough," the judge said, his voice sharp as he banged his gavel again. "This court will proceed. We will have order." But it wasn't just order that was needed. It was accountability. The kind of accountability that had never been asked of officers like Hayes before. And for the first time, Arthur felt like he wasn't just a man who had been wronged. He was a man with a voice, a man whose voice was about to break through the silence that had allowed men like Hayes to keep their power unchecked for so long. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had watched as Daniel Cole had taken control of the room, as the truth about Hayes had been laid bare. His hands were clenched into fists, and for a moment, Arthur thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the prosecutor's eyes. Maybe he had believed the narrative that had been fed to him, the one where Arthur was just another statistic, just another black man who couldn't be trusted. But now, even the prosecutor knew that this wasn't about race, about guilt, or innocence. It was about power, about the way people like Hayes had used their authority to destroy lives with impunity. "I'm done," the prosecutor finally muttered under his breath, as though defeated by the weight of what had been revealed. The room went silent again. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was unbearable. The system, it seemed, was finally starting to crack. Daniel Cole stood tall, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the truth. You've seen how Arthur Dawson was treated not as a person, but as a problem. You've seen how Officer Hayes, the man who should have been protecting him, chose to belittle him, to mock him, to degrade him. This isn't just about this case. This is about every time someone like Arthur has been silenced. Every time someone like Officer Hayes has walked away without consequence. We are asking you now to hold Officer Hayes accountable, not just for his actions, but for the system that allowed him to act with impunity for so long." Daniel paused, his eyes sweeping over the jury. "This is your chance. This is your chance to show that justice, real justice, is possible, that the truth can still be heard." Arthur's breath caught in his throat, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something else. It was a quiet triumph, the kind of triumph that came not from winning, but from finally speaking the truth. For the first time, Arthur Dawson had the power to make the world see him as he was, human. Not just a victim, not just a man with a stutter, but a man who had fought for his dignity and would never let anyone take it from him again. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the kind of silence that came before the storm, before the final verdict, and whatever came next, Arthur knew one thing. He had already won. The courtroom was as still as a storm before it broke, the silence thick with anticipation. Arthur Dawson sat at the witness stand, his fingers clutching the edges of the podium, his chest rising and falling in time with the nervous beat of his heart. His gaze, once filled with hesitation, now held a quiet, unwavering resolve. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, eyes that had once looked down on him, eyes that had once mocked him. But now those eyes were different. They weren't just observing him, they were weighing him, questioning him, and for the first time, they were seeing him. Across the room, Officer Hayes, the man whose actions had sparked this trial, sat stiffly in his seat. His posture, once so confident and sure, had now become rigid, defensive. His face had lost its arrogance, replaced by an uncomfortable tightness, as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. The mockery, the belittling, the cruelty he had always used to assert his power had crumbled under the weight of the truth. And he knew it. The jury watched, eyes darting between the defense and the prosecution, torn between the words they had heard and the image they had formed of Arthur. A man who, for the first time, stood not as a victim, but as a force. There was no doubt in their minds now. The truth had become undeniable. The lies had been exposed. The system had been cracked open for everyone to see. But now, it was time to decide what would come next. As the trial stretched on, Daniel Cole's voice remained a constant anchor, each word sharper than the last. He had taken the reins of the courtroom, steering the trial away from the typical back and forth of legalese and into something more personal. He wasn't just defending Arthur, he was making a statement. And with every word, the walls that had protected Officer Hayes and the corrupt system around him began to crack, bit by bit. "We've heard the testimony. We've seen the footage," Daniel said, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable power. "But what we haven't heard, not truly, is why this keeps happening. Why men like Officer Hayes, people like him, are allowed to act with impunity. Why the system that is supposed to protect the public has instead been protecting men like him for years, covering up their abuse, their hatred, and their racism." The words rang out in the courtroom like a bell tolling in the distance, calling for justice, for truth, for accountability. And for the first time, the jury seemed to stir, their expressions shifting as the weight of the argument hit them. The prosecutor, who had once seemed so sure of his position, sat back in his chair, his face unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. The momentum of the trial had shifted, and now it was heading towards something much more profound than just a verdict. Daniel turned to address the jury directly, his voice unflinching. "We are not here to make excuses for Officer Hayes. We are not here to allow him to hide behind his badge. We are here because of a deeper truth. The truth that men like Arthur Dawson have been silenced for too long. Men who have been reduced to stereotypes, to criminals, to objects of ridicule. Men who have been told that their lives, their voices, their humanity don't matter. And that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is something we cannot allow to stand any longer." Arthur's heart raced in his chest, but now it was for a different reason. His eyes, once downcast, now met the eyes of the jury. He could feel the weight of their gaze, but it was no longer oppressive. It wasn't the weight of pity or of mockery. It was the weight of respect, the weight of recognition. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, not as a victim, but as a person. And in that moment, everything, the years of humiliation, the mocking, the fear, seemed to melt away. He was here, standing in his truth, and that was something no one could take away from him. The judge banged his gavel, and the courtroom fell into silence once more. "The court will adjourn for the night," the judge announced, his voice carrying an air of finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for closing statements." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, but it was clear to everyone that the trial was far from over. As the room began to empty, Arthur remained seated, his mind racing. He was exhausted, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building inside him. Tomorrow would be the moment of reckoning. Tomorrow, they would find out whether justice was something that could still be achieved, or whether the system would continue to protect those who abused their power. As Arthur stood to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Daniel Cole standing beside him, his expression unreadable, but the respect in his eyes was undeniable. "You did well today, Arthur," Daniel said quietly, "but the hardest part is still ahead. Tomorrow, we finish this." Arthur nodded, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe that the truth would win out, that the jury would see what had been done to him and so many others. But the weight of the past hung heavily on him. He had been let down by the system so many times before. How could he know this time would be different? Daniel seemed to sense his uncertainty. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we've already won. We've made them see the truth. And we've made them hear you." Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked out of the courtroom, his mind still spinning with the events of the day. Outside, the city was alive with noise, horns honking, people talking, the sounds of a world moving forward. A world that seemed oblivious to the weight of what was happening inside the courthouse. But Arthur wasn't part of that world. Not anymore. He had stepped out of the shadows, and now, whether he won or lost, he had taken his place in the fight for justice. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, lawyers, spectators. All of them eager to witness the final moments of a trial that had already become a symbol of something far larger than any one case. The tension in the room was palpable. the air charged with the weight of history. Daniel Cole stood up as the judge called the court to order, his posture confident, his voice steady as he addressed the jury one final time. "You've heard the testimony," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "You've seen the footage. You've listened to the mockery, the degradation, and the humiliation that has been allowed to stand unchallenged for so long. But now, it is time for you to decide what kind of world you want to live in. Will you stand with the truth, or will you allow the lies to continue?" Daniel paused, his eyes sweeping over the jury, making sure each of them understood the gravity of the moment. Arthur Dawson's life, his dignity, his voice, is not just his own. It is the life of every man and woman who has been silenced, who has been made to feel less than. And it is up to you to decide whether you will stand up for that truth. Will you stand for justice, or will you let it slip away again? Arthur's heart raced as he stood in front of the jury, his breath shallow but steady. He had done everything he could. He had spoken his truth. And now, it was up to them. The judge raised his gavel, and the room fell into a tense silence. "It is time for the jury to deliberate," he said. And as the door closed behind the jury, Arthur Dawson knew that he had done all he could. He had fought for his dignity. He had fought for every person who had been mistreated, who had been cast aside by a system that had never cared for them. Now, all he could do was wait and hope. The room was suffocating with tension. The jury had been deliberating for hours now, each minute stretching longer than the last. Arthur Dawson sat in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. The courtroom, once filled with noise and clamour, had become a place of quiet anticipation. Outside, the world continued to move, cars honking, people talking, children laughing. But inside, everything was still. Everything was waiting. Arthur didn't know how much longer he could stand it. He had fought so hard, endured so much, just to reach this point. But no matter how hard he tried, the weight of doubt kept creeping in. What if it wasn't enough? What if the jury didn't see the truth the way he did? What if, in the end, the system that had failed him so many times before would fail him again? He could still hear Officer Hayes's mocking voice in his head, feel the sting of those words, the laughter that had followed. He had spent his entire life trying to prove he was worthy, trying to prove that his voice mattered. But in that courtroom, in the face of power, in the face of mockery and hate, Arthur had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. He had found the strength to stand tall, to speak when the world had always told him to stay silent. Daniel Cole sat beside him, a silent presence, always steady, always calm. He had believed in Arthur from the start, believed in the truth that had been buried for so long. He hadn't just defended Arthur. He had made the jury see him, not as a victim, not as someone to be pitied, but as a man with a voice, someone who deserved respect. And now, with the jury deliberating in the other room, all they could do was wait for the final verdict. The judge stood, his gavel in hand, as the door to the jury room opened. The room seemed to hold its breath as the jury filed back into their seats. Each one of them looked worn, tired, but resolute. Arthur's heart raced. He wanted to look at them, to see if any of them had already made up their minds, but he couldn't bring himself to. The foreman of the jury stood up, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer William Hayes, guilty of misconduct and abuse of power during the arrest of Arthur Dawson." A gasp filled the room, but it wasn't from Arthur, it wasn't from Daniel. It wasn't from anyone in the defense team. The gasp came from the prosecution, from Officer Hayes, from everyone who had tried to bury the truth. The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle, and for the first time, Arthur felt a lightness he hadn't known in his entire life. He had waited for this moment for so long, had fought for this truth, had endured the mockery, the humiliation, the years of being nothing more than a statistic. Hayes sat frozen in his seat, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his badge and his power would shield him from any consequences. But in that moment, in that single breath, everything had changed. The jury had seen him. The jury had seen the truth. Daniel stood slowly, his face calm, his expression unreadable. But there was a glint in his eyes, pride, satisfaction, and something else. A quiet acknowledgement that this battle was not just one for Arthur. It was one for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been mocked, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. It was a victory for dignity, for humanity, for the truth that no one could hide anymore. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial. This court is adjourned. Officer Hayes, you will be remanded into custody immediately for sentencing. The room erupted. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, but the sound of the chaos around him seemed distant. It felt like he was floating, like he was hearing the world from a distance. He had done it. They had done it. His voice had been heard. And in that moment, in that silence, Arthur Dawson finally felt free. But as he stood, as Daniel reached out to shake his hand, Arthur's eyes found Hayes. The officer had stood, his face now twisted with rage, his hands trembling at his sides. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that a man like Arthur, someone he had mocked, belittled, humiliated, would stand up to him, would force him to face the truth. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He stood tall as he could, and for the first time in his life, he looked Hayes in the eye. Not with fear, not with hatred, but with the understanding that this moment had been a long time coming. You never should have done it, Arthur said quietly, his voice steady. You never should have thought you could get away with it. Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to defend himself anymore. The courtroom was no longer his domain. The system that had once protected him had turned on him, and now he was exposed. There was no escape. Daniel Cole stood beside Arthur, his hand resting gently on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. The fight had been won. And as the doors to the courtroom swung open, and as Officer Hayes was led away in handcuffs, Arthur felt something he hadn't known he was missing. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different. That maybe, after everything he had been through, he could finally live in a world where his voice mattered, where he was seen, where he wasn't just a target, but a man. Outside, the world still spun. People still went about their lives, oblivious to the battle that had just been fought in that room. But for Arthur, the world had changed. He had fought for justice. He had fought for dignity. And in that fight, he had found something more powerful than the fear that had once controlled him. He had found his place in the world. As Arthur and Daniel walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. The victory was sweet, but there was still so much to be done. The system that had allowed Officer Hayes to act with impunity was still out there, still alive, still crushing lives. But Arthur knew something now. He knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak out, to fight, the truth would never be buried again. This was just the beginning, and the world would have to listen. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What moments stood out to you? Have you ever experienced racism or seen it happen around you? Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us continue bringing you powerful narratives. We wish you a wonderful day ahead, and if you've listened until the very end, leave a comment with the phrase, "Justice isn't given, it's earned," so we know you're with us through the whole journey. Thank you.